Hey there, welcome back to Snail Story. How are you feeling today? Is it rainy or sunny where you are? Tell us, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to know who's sharing this quiet moment with us. Today's story is the final chapter in the journey of Silas Everett, a man who once lived by rules and power, and Ella, the little girl who slowly opened his heart, along with her gentle, resilient mother, Lucille. What began as a silent act of kindness has grown into something deeper, a bond formed not by blood, but by choice. In this final part, you'll witness a man choosing love over legacy, and a family quietly forming in the most unexpected place. A small apartment, a shared cup of tea, and the decision to stay if this kind of soft, healing love speaks to you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell for more. Now, let's begin. Silas Everett began each day the same way he had for the past 15 years. Precisely, quietly, and without a single deviation. The alarm went off at 5:15 a.m. He got out of bed, brushed his teeth, and splashed cold water on his face to fully wake up. No coffee, no background music, no silk robe like the wealthy often wore in movies. Just the suit he had ironed the night before, the polished shoes lined up neatly at the foot of the bed, and the familiar footsteps from his bedroom to the elevator of the penthouse he was renting, a place so luxurious even the doorman wore leather shoes at 6:45 a.m. sharp. A black car pulled up to the building. The driver said nothing, merely opened the door with the precision of a programmed routine. At 7:12, Silas arrived at the headquarters of Everett and Arlon, one of the largest real estate conglomerates on the East Coast, where every decision carried tens of millions of dollars in value. By 7:30, like every other day, Silas was seated in his leather executive chair on the 46th floor, surrounded by glass walls overlooking the city like a miniature map. From that height, everything looked orderly, structured just the way he liked it. A world where everything was under control. Silas didn't need many people around him. He disliked idle chatter and had no patience for explaining things others should have known already. To his employees, he was tough, efficient, and unapproachable, and he was perfectly fine with that. His inner world had no doors for others to knock on. That morning, like hundreds before, he was reviewing a presentation for a major merger scheduled for the afternoon. Red pen notes lined the margins, precise, evenly spaced. His assistant, a young man named Max, entered so quietly he might as well have been a shadow. He placed new documents on the desk without a word. But then, Max didn't leave. He stood there, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. Silas looked up, his brow barely furrowed. "What is it?" he asked. Not harsh, but cold, as always. Max inhaled slightly. It's a minor thing, but I thought you should know." "Go on." "Ms. Lucille Grant, the janitor on this floor, has been absent for 2 days straight without notice." Silas stopped writing. The pen paused mid-word. Something in him hesitated, not because the news was critical, but because it disrupted the perfection of his routine. He wasn't accustomed to unpredictability. "Did she call in?" he asked, eyes still on the page. "No, sir." "And no reason has been submitted." "I wasn't sure if we should terminate her contract immediately." Silas closed the folder with quiet finality, like putting an end to an unnecessary chain of events. The name Lucille rang a faint bell. A middle-aged woman, quiet, who usually appeared in the evenings to clean the glass, tidy up the desks, and vanish before any executives arrived. He had never met her, never paid attention, and yet something about her absence wouldn't let him brush it off like any other minor disruption. Perhaps because, in his mind, punctuality was a form of morality. Someone missing work without notice, whoever they was, simply unacceptable. He didn't care much about the reason, only the consequence. "Give me her phone number, Silas," said Max. Hesitated for a second. clearly surprised by the request. But he quickly typed it into his phone, copied it down, and handed Silas a slip of paper. Silas held it, flipping it between his fingers as if still weighing the decision. He didn't know why he wanted to call. Maybe because he hated negligence. Maybe it was simply because for the first time in months, something had veered off script. He dialed Dot in his mind. He had already prepared a line sharp, concise, almost disciplinary. This is CEO Silas Everett. I'd like to know why you've been absent without notice. I'll let it go this time, but next time the phone rang. Once, twice, a third time, then a fourth, and then hello. A voice answered soft as a whisper, stopping his thoughts midstream. It wasn't the voice of an adult woman. It wasn't a rushed apology, not an excuse. Just a little girl. The voice was so quiet, he almost thought he imagined it. Hello. And in that exact moment, mid all the justifications, to reprimand, to fire, to discard the inconvenience, something inside Silas cracked. A small crack, but undeniable. And he didn't yet know that from that tiny voice, his meticulously perfect life would change forever. Hello. The voice came again soft, trembling, almost dissolving into the phone static. Silas Everett, a man who always knew exactly what to say and what to do, suddenly found his mind blank. He had rehearsed a concise warning, but now every word felt out of place. There was no mistaking it. That was a child's voice. He sat up straighter, the phone still pressed to his ear. But his body slightly tenses if he had stepped into unfamiliar territory. The call hadn't been disconnected. The child was still waiting. He lowered his voice and asked gently, "And you are?" A moment of silence. Then the girl's voice came again, a little clearer. "I'm Ella. My mom, she can't talk right." Now, Silas narrowed his eyes, tilting his head slightly back, as though trying to picture the girl's face through her voice. Her mom. He didn't need to ask. He knew it was Lucille Grant, the janitor he'd planned to dismiss that very morning. "Is she unwell?" he asked. And for the first time that day, his voice didn't carry its usual chill. "Yes," Ella replied, barely above a whisper. "She's sick. She's been lying down since yesterday." Silas was quiet. Something strange stirred in his chest, not anger, not confusion. More like a weight he didn't quite understand. "Can you tell me what's wrong with your mom?" he asked, his tone softening another degree. "I don't really know. She's got a fever. She's shaking and she hasn't eaten anything. She said she just needed a bit of rest and she'd be okay. But she still can't get up." Silas leaned back slightly, rubbing his forehead. For the first time, his headache wasn't from contracts, but from a child's explanation. Ella's voice wasn't whiny. It wasn't even frightened. It was calm, matter-of-fact, like someone who had grown used to taking care of her mother. Used to explaining to adults things that no child should ever have to. "So is there anyone there with you and your mom?" he asked, as if needing to disprove the scenario taking shape in his mind. Ella hesitated, then whispered, "No one." Her answer sent a jolt through his spine. A gravely ill woman. A 6-year-old child. A quiet apartment no one knew about. Simply because no one ever asked. "You're alone with your mom?" he asked again, just to be sure. "Yes," Ella answered. And then, silence. Silas was about to ask something else. But Ella spoke first, hesitantly. If you need someone to clean, I can do it. I can wipe the tables. I know how to use the wet wipes." His heart missed a beat, not because the offer was strange, but because of how she said it, as if that was the only way to repay her mother's absence. To avoid being scolded, to hold on to the job her mother quietly did every night, a 6-year-old offering to clean a 46th-floor office building. Silas was speechless. His throat went dry, and something ached deep in his chest like a lump stuck halfway. "Ella," he said, calling her by name for the first time. "You don't have to do that. No one expects you to take your mom's place. You're just a child." But then Ella said something. Just for words that brought down everything he'd ever believed in about discipline and structure. "But we need money." That was it. No sobbing, no begging. But it hit Silas like someone had dropped an entire building on his chest. He had once fired an entire team over a half-hour mistake in a report. He'd shut down entire departments for being inefficient. But never had he imagined that behind a missed workday was a 6-year-old girl picking up the phone for her sick mother, offering to clean just to help keep a few dollars of salary. A slow-burning shame crept through his chest. He couldn't remember the last time he felt this way. Maybe when his father passed. Or maybe never. "Ella," he said slowly, "I'm very sorry you had to think about that. Your mom doesn't need to worry about work right now. Can you tell her I hope she gets better soon? Would that be okay?" "Yes," the girl replied softly. Silas thought he might hear something else, but the line went dead. Ella had hung up. He sat there for a long time, staring at the phone still glowing on his desk. Everything spread out before him, thick documents. Financial projections, international partnership plans suddenly felt distant. He couldn't find himself in those numbers anymore. All he could see was a child's imagined gaze, a small room, a feverish mother, and a whispered truth. "We need money." Silas set the phone down and slowly stood up. He knew he couldn't let this be just an incident. Couldn't allow himself to live the same way, not after hearing something no one else had heard. He turned toward the door, where morning light still poured in through thick glass, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like a new day was truly beginning. Silas Everett didn't return to work after that call. He sat motionless in his office for nearly half an hour, hand resting lightly on his forehead, eyes fixed on the glass window where the early winter sky stretched out in a cold silver gray. Below, the endless stream of cars continued, as if nothing mattered more than the contracts awaiting signature, the proposals needing approval. But inside him, something had broken, quietly, irrevocably, not just because of a child's voice, but because of how Ella had said the kind of words no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. "We need money." Only for words, but they fell, heavy as rain that could drown a whole city. He stood up and grabbed his coat, left behind his phone, documents, laptop, everything. Said nothing to anyone. Just left a short note for Max. "Reschedule all meetings to tomorrow. I'm stepping out." The elevator descended slowly, as if it too were questioning whether this trip was worth it. Every floor number it passed was one Silas had helped build, shape, and control. But today, he no longer belonged to any of it. In the parking lot, Silas drove himself. No chauffeur. No GPS. Only the address listed in Lucille Grant's HR Fila place he never thought he'd find himself going. Apartment 14. Sat in an old red brick building on the outskirts of the city where there were no glittering malls, no fancy cafes, and nothing that needed development. A place where everything seemed to have stopped growing a long time ago. The sleek black car came to a quiet stop beside the cracked sidewalk. Silas didn't get out right away. He sat behind the wheel, staring through the window, hands resting, hesitant. Not because he was afraid, but because he had never stepped into someone else's life like this. Not with power, not with money, just with concern. He looked at the worn stairs, the peeling window frames, the faded curtains hiding humble furniture. Inside. Then he stepped out. Knocking on apartment 14's door wasn't like ringing a buzzer at the office. There was no polite chime, no receptionist, no glass barrier. Just a weathered wooden door, a loose doorknob, and a wait that felt longer than usual behind the door. He heard footsteps, soft, as if careful not to wake someone. The door cracked. Open it was Ella. She wore a light pink knitted dress, slightly worn. Her golden hair was tied with a frayed ribbon, hanging unevenly. Her small face was pale from lack of sleep, but her eyes were wide, looking at him without surprise, without fear. Just silently, as if she had been waiting. "You're from where?" "My mom works, right?" Ella asked, her voice barely a breath. Silas nodded gently. "Yes, I'm Silas. I came to check on your mom, if that's okay." Ella glanced behind her, listening for any sound inside. Then she stepped back and nodded. "Yes, please come in." No invitation could have been more sincere. Silas stepped inside. The apartment was small, just a few square meters. Paint peeling. From the walls, a single bed pressed against the window, an old dining table next to the kitchen, and yet everything was tidy. Pillows neatly folded, clothes stacked carefully in a plastic basket in the corner. On the table, an empty ramen wrapper, and a glass of water already cold. Lucille Grant lay on the bed, facing the wall. Under the thin blanket, her frame was surprisingly small. Not the image of a woman working long night shifts as he'd once imagined. More like someone trying to hide her exhaustion so she wouldn't trouble anyone else. Ella walked over, leaned down and whispered, "Mom, Mr. Silas is here." Lucille turned slowly. Her face was pale, eyes sunken from high fever and fatigue. Still, she tried to smile, fragile, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry I didn't think you'd actually come," she said softly. Silas didn't reply right away. He simply pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat. "I called earlier," answered the phone. Lucille closed her eyes briefly. Her cheek trembled slightly. She gripped the edge of the blanket. "I told her not to, but she must have been scared no one would know." Silas shook his head, more gently than he expected of himself. "There's no need to apologize. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." The room was quiet for a moment. Ella stood by the bed, one hand resting on the pillow's edge. Like a tiny guardian, Silas looked at Lucille. Then around the room, every modest detail, telling him this was a world entirely different from the 46th floor. And for the first time, he found a place without luxury where he actually wanted to stay. "You don't need to worry about your job," he said, speaking slowly, like placing stones gently on the ground. "Take all the time you need to rest." Lucille blinked, a tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly turned her face away. "I didn't mean to be a bother. This isn't a bother," Silas interrupted, but his voice was soft, like a whisper. "I came because I wanted to." At that moment, Ella stepped closer to him, cautiously, like approaching a stranger, and asked shyly, "Would you like some water?" Silas chuckled a quiet, real laugh. He nodded, double quotes, "Thank you. I'd be happy to have some." And in that moment, a worn-down apartment, with a feverish mother and a little girl offering water. Silas Everett felt his heart warm for the first time. Not because of success, not because of control, but because, at last, he had stepped through a small door to see the world behind the silence and realize that every absence hides a life he never knew existed. Silas left apartment 14 late that afternoon. The air wasn't particularly cold, but he pulled his coat collar higher than usual. Not because of the wind, but because something inside him was still unsettled. On the drive back to the city center, he didn't turn on the radio. The car moved past bustling streets, blinking traffic lights, and waves of people rushing home, but Silas barely noticed. All he could see in his mind was the image of little Ella holding a glass of water with trembling hands, placing it on the table with the carefulness of someone serving someone very important, and Lucille's face pale, exhausted, yet holding. onto a quiet dignity, the kind that only people used to enduring alone carry. Silas had seen hundreds of faces in his life, but none had made him stop like the faces of that mother and child. The next morning, as the office lights flickered on, Max's assistant tentered with the day's schedule and a fresh cup of coffee. He opened his mouth to speak, but Silas looked up and said firmly, "Get me a list of mobile health clinics in the Edgewater district, and also weekly fresh food delivery services." Max froze. After a beat, he asked softly for internal staff. Silas shook his head, offering no further explanation. "Just do it, as soon as possible." Max nodded and stepped out. Silas stared at the open report on his screen, but didn't process a single number. He'd spent a long time thinking the night before. A part of him had tried to whisper, "This isn't your concern. You're the CEO. Stay in your lane." But the other part, the part that refused to be silenced, kept replaying the image of Ella's tiny hand on that glass, her trusting eyes, and the words, "I can wipe the tables for my mom." He couldn't forget, and he didn't want to. That afternoon, Silas returned to apartment 14, not as a boss, but as a man carrying a bag filled with fresh groceries, some fever medicine, a few packets of chamomile tea, and one small Toyo watercolor paint set with brushes and thick paper. Ella opened the door again. This time, she didn't look at him like a stranger. She smiled, eyes lighting up at the sight of the colorful bag. "Hi, Mr. Silas," she chirped, nearly squealing. "You really came back." "I told you I would," Silas replied, smiling gently. The room was still small, still modest, but it no longer felt as heavy as before. Lucille was able to sit up now, propped against some pillows, her hair loosely tied back. Her face remained pale, but her eyes had a bit more life. "Mr. Silas," she said cautiously, "you don't have to do all this." "I know," he said, placing the bag on the table. "But I want to." Lucille tried to sit up straighter, to offer a proper thank you, but he raised a hand, motioning softly. "No need for formalities. Just think of it as a friend stopping by." She paused for a moment. A friend. Such a simple word, but in her world, it was a luxury. For years, Lucille had lived between silence and fatigue. People didn't ask, and she didn't offer. She thought that was the only way to survive in a world that had no patience for the weak. But now, there was a man in her kitchen, carefully placing groceries on shelves, asking gently, "Which tea helps you sleep best?" Ella skipped around. Him, chatting away about the neighbor's white cat, the cactus her mom once tried to grow, and the time she nearly fell down the stairs but didn't tell her mom because I didn't want her to worry. Silas listened to every word. He didn't need to say much. Just being there was enough. From that day on, he visited at least twice a week. Sometimes he brought soup, sometimes a packet of flower seeds, sometimes nothing at all, just himself. To drink tea and listen as Lucille shared stories about her old job before cleaning offices, about the husband she lost when Ella was still in her belly, and about rainy nights with no money for electricity when she still tried to tell Ella bedtime stories. Silas didn't ask too many questions, but everything Lucille shared left quiet imprints on his heart, like the layers of stone shaped by time. Not loud, but lasting. He didn't speak much about himself either. But one afternoon, as Ella painted and Lucille poured tea, Silas said, "Quietly, when I was Ella's age, I lived in a shelter in southern Georgia. My mom worked 2 jobs. Every time I had a fever, I'd lie alone in the dark, listening for the sound of her slippers coming home." Lucille looked up. She didn't ask for more, but in her eyes, there was understanding. From then on, no more explanations were needed. Once, while Silas was fixing a squeaky chair in their living room, Ella approached, holding a freshly painted picture. She held it out to him, her eyes bright. "Mr. Silas, I drew you." He looked down. In the drawing, he was colored in brown, wearing a long coat, standing between two hearts. One smaller heart was labeled Ella, the other scribbled clumsily. Mom, Silas froze. His hand tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. No one said anything after that. But from that moment on, he knew he was no longer an outsider. He had one foot in that family now, and though the words were never spoken, the commitment had begun to take shape through his presence, through warm meals, through unannounced returns that somehow always came just when they needed him most. A month passed. Silas Everett continued his regular visits to apartment 14. They were no longer hesitant. Uncertain visits. No more cautious glances from a single mother or the shyness of a 6-year-old child. Now, each time the wooden door opened, he was greeted with a genuine smile and a cheerful little exclamation, "Mr. Silas is here." Ella was always the first to run out. She opened the door with both hands, hair tied crookedly, dress a little wrinkled but always clean. Every time she saw him, Ella had a new story to tell, a new drawing to show, or a tiny trinket she wanted to share. As for Lucille, she had grown more relaxed, no longer apologizing for their modest home, no longer carrying the weight of being a burden. Silas wasn't sure exactly when things began to shift. He only knew that now he was used to removing his shoes at the door, used to the sound of water boiling in the kitchen, used to the cushion waiting on the couch. Some afternoons he sat reading in the living room. Lucille brewed tea in the kitchen. Ella colored beside him. No one said much, but the silence wasn't distance anymore. It was comfort. Once Lucille said, "When I get better, I'll go back to work. I don't feel right just sitting still." Silas looked at her and didn't respond immediately. She said it gently, like someone who'd spent too long carrying everything alone. Someone who, even when helped, still felt the need to prove she could stand up on her own. He didn't argue. He just nodded. "Whatever you choose to do, I'll support you. But there's no need to rush." Lucille nodded back, her eyes slightly lowered. A quiet, grateful nod. They began talking more, not just about her recovery, but about the weather, the rising cost of groceries, Ella's school supplies, even about how Silas had hated pumpkin. As a child, Lucille fairly laughed for the first time when he admitted, "I used to think string beans were little snakes. My mom had to feed me with a toy spoon just to get me to eat them." Her laugh wasn't loud. It didn't echo like in the movies. It was a small smile, a flicker of light in her eyes, but to Silas, it was a major victory. A genuine one. On Monday, he brought apple pastries. On Thursday, he stopped by a used bookstore and picked up a few short comics for Ella. On Saturday, he brought a small mint plant in a clay pot to bring a little green into the space. He said no one asked him to, but little by little, they began to look forward to it. "Mr. Silas, what's in your bag today?" Ella would always ask, every time he walked in. Then she would run up and lightly tug his arm to check if he was hiding anything in his coat pocket. He often left a small candy there, or a new colored pen, or just a folded piece of paper with a note. "Try to finish coloring a full picture today, okay?" Lucille had seen the little gifts, and for the first time she didn't say, "You don't have to do this." Instead, she said, "You're very observant." Silas chuckled. "I learned from Ella. She's the one teaching me." One evening, it rained. He arrived late. Ella sat curled by the window, hugging a comic book. She hadn't started reading. When she heard the knock at the door, she ran to open it right away. "I was afraid you wouldn't come today." Silas looked at her tousled hair, her eyes slightly red with worry. He knelt down and gently wiped the raindrops from her forehead with his sleeve. "I promised, didn't I?" Ella nodded, then suddenly wrapped her arms around him. A tight, long hug, no thank you needed, just presence. Lucille watched from a distance, silent. But when Silas stepped inside, she spoke softly. "You've changed the air in this place." Silas turned to her. "Changed how?" She smiled. "Since you started coming here, this room, it's no longer just a place to survive day by day. It has laughter now, the smell of tea, of baked apples, of someone familiar." Silas didn't know how to respond. He just smiled and sat down on the now familiar chair. Ella brought out her crayons and handed him a wax pencil. "Today, you get 2 color flowers." He nodded. Ella placed a blank page between them and said quietly, "I'll color one half, you color the other. That way, we do it together." That sentence, simple as any child's words, made Silas's chest tighten. Not because of any grand meaning, but because, for the first time in his life, he had been truly invited into a moment so small, so ordinary. Not a business proposal across a polished table. Not a contract filled with clauses. Just a child's invitation to color a flower together. And in that moment, Silas knew. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped being Silas Everett, CEO. He was simply Silas, the man Ella trusted, the man Lucille was beginning to wait for, someone familiar. Silas Everett had never imagined he could live 2 lives at once. One was on the 46th floor, gleaming, air-conditioned, filled with well-dressed people talking about profits, expansion strategies, and the company's future. There, he was the CEO, the decision-maker, the man who wasn't allowed to hesitate. The other was apartment 14, where the floors were scratched, the chairs slightly tilted, and the walls still in need of paint. There, he was Uncle Silas, the one who brought pastries, watercolor paints, and sometimes just the right presents at the right time, day by day. The boundary between these 2 places blurred, and he began to wonder where he truly belonged. That afternoon, Silas left the meeting room late. The meeting had gone over schedule due to an investment issue on the west side. The staff were tense, the CFO overly detailed. And Silas kept glancing at his watch, 5:17 p.m. By now, he should have left the building. Should have been standing at the door of apartment 14, holding a bag of mango pastries Ella once called the best in the world. He should have been on that squeaky old sofa, listening to Lucille talk about her days studying accounting when she was younger, or listening to Ella recite a poem she memorized at school. Instead, he was still here in a cold room, surrounded by slides and scripted voices. When the meeting finally ended, everyone began to rise. Max, his assistant, approached with another stack of documents. "Mr. Everett, there's a Zoom call with the San Diego office at 6. Silas raised a hand to stop him. Then looked at Max and said calmly, "Reschedule it for tomorrow." Max hesitated, "But they've been preparing since last week." "Reschedule," Silas repeated, not loudly, but firmly. Max nodded and stepped back, still confused by the sudden shift in the boss who is always punctual, always strict. Silas offered no explanation. He simply stacked his files, put on his coat, and headed for the elevator. By the time he arrived at the apartment, it was already dusk. The rain had just stopped. The pavement was wet, and yellow streetlights shimmered in the puddles. He stood at the door, about to knock when it swung open. Ella, she looked at him, let out a tiny sigh, most like a breath of relief, then beamed. "I thought you weren't coming today." "I'm just a little late," he said, holding up the pastry bag. "But I brought something." Ella squealed and turned back toward the apartment. "Mom, he really brought the mango pastries." Lucille stepped out, her hair tied back, wearing a simple gray sweater, holding a glass cup of tea. When she saw him, she smiled. There was something different in her eyes. Warmer, deeper. "You came." Just 3 words, but to Silas, it felt like an acknowledgement. He was no longer a stranger. That evening, they ate pastries and chatted around the small table. Silas told a story about how, as a kid, he once walked over 5 kilometers to school just to avoid being late for a math test. Lucille laughed. And now you're late for mango pastries. Ella giggled, her fingers stained with paint, drawing Silas as a chef holding a tray of baked goods. The drawing was messy, but full of life. He taped it to the wall with masking tape, right next to the previous one. Uncle Silas and Ella's. Rose, that night, he stayed longer. The tea had cooled. The TV played softly in the background, and Ella had fallen asleep on the couch. Lucille sat across from him, her hands folded quietly in her lap. "Are you tired?" she asked, her voice low. Silas shook his head. "No. On the contrary, I feel like I can finally breathe." Lucille was silent, her eyes studying his face. "You still haven't told me about your life," she said softly. "Out there. When you're not here." Silas looked at her for a moment, then replied, "I'm not sure I want to keep living out there anymore." The words made her pause as if she had just heard something fragile, yet deeply serious. "I used to think that working, staying in control, keeping everything in order was the way to not feel empty," he continued. "But since meeting you, too, I've started to realize that order doesn't stop you from feeling lonely." Lucille pressed her lips together. She said nothing, but he saw her hands tremble ever so slightly. He looked over at Ella, fast asleep, hair tousled across her cheek, one hand still loosely holding a crayon. Then he turned back to Lucille. "If you'll let me, I'd like to keep being here." Lucille looked up. Her eyes didn't show surprise, only quiet emotion. Deep, undeniable. "You know," she said softly, "this isn't something people do just to be kind." "I know," he replied. They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Some things, once felt deeply, don't need to be explained. That night, when Silas returned to his penthouse, he didn't turn on the lights. He passed a spotless kitchen, the leather chairs, the perfectly placed artwork, the wall clock ticking on rhythm. But everything was silent. No laughter, no random stories. No one coloring or asking, "Did you have a good day today?" Just one man, accomplished, respected, standing in the middle of his expensive apartment. Suddenly realizing, every time he left apartment 14, he left a piece of his heart behind. On Monday morning, Silas Everett arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sky outside was veiled in a soft mist, and the city had yet to stir with its usual noise. But within him, something was starting to reach its limit. He sat in his office. On the 46th floor, the leather chair still cool, the coffee still steaming, documents stacked neatly. Everything was just as it had been for years. But this morning, it all felt foreign. Max entered at exactly 8 a.m., his expression polite, but slightly cautious. "Mr. Everett, there's something I think you should know." Silas looked up. "What is it?" Max handed him a folder. Not a financial report. Not a meeting agenda. It was a proposal and investment partnership from a global corporation Silas had pursued for over 3 years. And this time, they were ready to return. "They want you to fly to Tokyo this Friday to sign the agreement," Max said. Silas opened the file. The numbers were impressive. A major breakthrough for the company. The clearest affirmation yet of the empire he'd spent his life building. But in his mind, he heard Ella's voice from the night before. "Mr. Silas, on Saturday, my teacher's hosting a storytelling day. I signed up. Mom said you could come listen, can ya?" He had promised. "I'll be there." And now, an overseas business trip. It's an opportunity no CEO would refuse, but also an absence. In that small world, where even one broken promise could shatter everything like glass, he closed the folder. "I need time to think," he said. Max looked at him as if he'd heard something unusual. Silas never needed time to make decisions. That afternoon, Silas didn't go to apartment 14. For the first time in weeks, T didn't show up. Ella sat by the window, holding her stuffed bunny. Lucille prepared tea as usual, but remained quiet. At 6:30, Ella looked up and asked, "Mom, isn't Mr. Silas coming today?" Lucille didn't answer right away. She gently placed her hand over her daughter's. "Maybe he's just a little busy today." Ella didn't cry, but her little eyes stared out into the empty evening beyond the window, quiet and still. Like a moonless night, Silas, meanwhile, sat in his high-rise apartment, soft yellow lights on. Dinner on the table, laptop still glowing, but he wasn't working. He was just sitting there, holding a drawing Ella had made the week before himself. Lucille and Ella standing under a tree with pink blossoms, holding hands. At the top, in a child's scrawling handwriting, "Our home." There were no words to describe what he felt. Not exactly fear, not quite regret. More like a quiet helplessness when the heart wants one thing and the world demands another. He could remain CEO, sign the deal, expand his empire, and return each night to a silent apartment with no one waiting, no one asking, "Did you have a good day today?" Or he could keep his promise to a 6-year-old child. On Tuesday morning, Silas arrived early, but he didn't go to the boardroom. Instead, he knocked on Max's office door. His assistant looked up, surprised. "I'm not going to Tokyo," Silas said, without hesitation. Max froze. "But this is, I know," Silas interrupted, calm but resolute. "I've chased those things my whole life." He paused, gazing through the glass. "Now, I just want to keep a promise." Max didn't understand. But for the first time, he saw his boss not as a CEO, not as a symbol of success, but as a man choosing to stay for something warm, even if no one ever recognized it. That afternoon, Silas returned to apartment 14. When he knocked, Ella opened the door, as usual, but this time she didn't smile right away. She looked at him, lips pressed tight, still holding her stuffed bunny. "You didn't come yesterday." Her voice was small, not angry, not accusing, but it hit him deep. "I'm sorry," he said, crouching to her level. "I should have told you. I was wrong. And I missed you very much." Ella was quiet for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I forgive you, but you have to come on Saturday. I'll be telling a story, hey? And I need you there." Silas smiled. "I promise. I'll be there." Lucille stood nearby, watching silently. When Silas stepped inside, she placed her hand gently over her chest, where her heart was beating softly, but stronger than ever. "You didn't have to choose like that," she said. "It's more as a shared feeling than a protest." "No." Silas looked at her. "I had to. Because there are some things, if I let them slip away, I won't be able to live with myself." That night, he read books with Ella and drank tea with Lucille. Nothing special. And yet that's what made it special, he realized. In that little apartment, he didn't have to prove anything. He just had to be there, and maybe, just maybe, that quiet presence, steady, unspoken, was the very thing he'd been searching for all his life. Let me know when you're ready for part 8. I'm here and ready. On Saturday morning, Silas Everett woke earlier than usual. He chose a simple button-up shirt, no tie, nothing fancy. For the first time in years, he didn't begin his day with financial news or executive emails. Instead, he sat at his dining table and unfolded a small piece of paper that Ella had slipped into his hand a few days ago. "Saturday storytelling at school. Starts at 10 a.m., Mr. Silas. Don't forget to come." In the corner of the page, she had drawn a smiling face and an open book. At the bottom, written in blue crayon with crooked letters, "You're my special guest." Silas folded the note carefully and placed it into his chest pocket. Today, he wasn't going out of duty. Not because of a promise. He was going because he truly wanted to be part of Ella's special morning. When he arrived, Lucille and Ella were already waiting at the foot of the building. Ella wore a yellow floral dress, her hair tied into 2 side ponytails. Her old canvas shoes, clean but well-worn. The moment she saw Silas, she ran toward him and grabbed his hand. "You came." Silas bent down and smiled. "Of course I did. I told you I would." Lucille stood nearby, smiling softly. She wore a white shirt and jeans simple, but for the first time, her face carried the glow of someone who had come back to life. "Thank you," she said quietly, as Ella ran ahead. "She's been looking forward to this day all week." Silas glanced at Ella, then back at Lucille. "So have I." The preschool community room was nestled in an old residential area, but its walls were full of colorful children's drawings. Paper letters on the wall read, "Our Storytelling Day." Each child took turns standing on a small platform to tell a short story. Some stumbled. Some forgot their lines. Some stared at their feet the whole time. When it was Ella's turn, she stepped up with an old picture book in hand. She stood straight, eyes scanning the crowd until they found his. Silas lifted a hand and gave her a small wave. She saw it and smiled. Then she began to tell the story of a little fox who got lost in the forest, scared and alone until he met a friend in a long coat who helped him find his way out and chose to stay with him. Always, because the little fox knew some people, once they show up, never leave you again. She finished, her voice quiet but steady. Applause filled the room. But Silas just sat there, a weight settling in his chest. A child's tale, it seemed, yet it mirrored his own life so closely. Perhaps even Ella didn't realize she had just told his story. After the ceremony, while parents snapped photos, Ella pulled him aside. "Did you like it?" she asked, eyes wide. "I loved it," he replied, bending closer. "And I'm very proud of you." Ella smiled, then whispered, "Thank you for coming. All my friends had moms and dads come. I have my mom, and I have you." Such a simple sentence, soft as breath, but Silas felt his eyes sting with heat. He placed a gentle hand on her head, brushing back her hair. "You know, I'm very happy. I got to be part of your day." That afternoon, they went home together. Lucille made lunch, egg sandwiches and apple salad. They sat around the table, sunlight filtering through the narrow window, bathing the room in a golden warmth. No one talked about work. No one worried about tomorrow. After the meal, Ella pulled out her colored paper and crayons. Silas sat beside her, sharpening pencils while listening to Lucille talk about how she once dreamed of going to college, but had to stop when she became pregnant. "I used to think being alone was enough," she said, eyes on the window. "As long as she was safe, as long as no one hurt her, I could bear anything." Silas didn't interrupt. He knew some things don't need comfort, just someone willing to listen. Lucille turned toward him, smiling slightly. "But then you showed up, and suddenly, being alone didn't feel like the truth anymore." Silas nodded. Something inside him expanded, not loud, not overwhelming, just a quiet feeling that he was finally where he belonged. At the end of the day, Lucille walked him to the door. Ella was napping in her room, hugging her stuffed bunny and a new drawing. A man in a long coat holding a little girl's hand as they walked toward a small house. Lucille leaned against the doorway, hands loosely clasped. The early summer breeze drifted through the hallway, carrying the faint scent of chamomile tea still warm in the kitchen. "Have you ever thought," she asked softly, "that sometimes what we need isn't someone who comes but someone who stays?" Silas didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way her hair fell gently around her neck. Her eyes tired but steady, and nodded, double quotes, "Yes. And I think I'm learning how to be that person." Lucille smiled, said nothing more. The door closed softly behind him, but this time, Silas didn't feel it marked the border between two worlds. It was simply another step on the path. He was now walking slowly, deliberately, not just to arrive, but to stay. At the end of June, on a rainy morning, droplets slid down the windows of the 46th floor office. Silas Everett had returned to work, not because he wanted to, but because some chapters needed to be closed properly. For the past 2 weeks, he had split his time half at the company, half at apartment 14. Each morning, he wore his suit, held his hot coffee, but in his mind was the image of Ella's drawing, the three of them standing together in a flower garden. Lucille had recovered fully. She had started working part-time at a bookstore near their neighborhood. Ella still went to school regularly, returning each afternoon with stories to share, waiting for Mr. Silas to arrive for dinner, and he did never missing a single day since. But today, Silas knew something with clarity. He couldn't postpone forever. Kingsley Corporation, a multinational conglomerate, had officially offered him the position of Executive Vice President for North America, based in Chicago, along with a salary and benefits that anyone would say yes to immediately. "This is your chance to return to the top," Max said as he handed over the offer letter. "No more running the entire company, just focus on strategy. They trust you, they need you." Silas held the file. It felt heavy in his hands. Chicago, the city he once dreamed of working in, living in, proving himself irreplaceable. But there was no Ella there, no Lucille. No dinners around a small wooden table, no childlike drawings taped to the walls, no scent of chamomile tea drifting through a cracked kitchen door. He sat quietly in his office until nightfall. As he gazed at the distant city lights, Silas remembered the story of the little fox Ella had told, about how when you find someone who truly cares, the most important thing is to stay. That evening, he arrived at apartment 14 later than usual. Lucille opened the door. Ella was already asleep. She looked at him with concern. "Are you okay?" Silas nodded and stepped inside, taking a seat silently. After a while, he spoke. "I received an offer. Executive Vice President, in Chicago." Lucille froze for a moment. Her eyes dimmed slightly, though she didn't seem surprised. Deep down, perhaps she had always known this day might come. "And will you go?" she asked softly. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked around the small apartment, a place where nothing was perfect, but everything felt warm. "I used to think I needed recognition, power, prestige, achievement," he said slowly. "But I've never felt peace like I do sitting here, beside you two." Lucille said nothing. Her fingers gently clutched the edge of the tablecloth. Silas looked up at her, his gaze deeper than any words. "If I leave, I'll lose the most precious thing I've ever had." Lucille bit her lip, then offered a quiet smile. "Silas, don't choose for me or for Ella. Choose for yourself." "I know," he nodded. "And the truth is, I don't want to go." She tilted her head slightly, as if to hide the tear that had begun to form at the corner of her eye. "Are you sure?" Silas smiled. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." 3 days later, he officially declined the executive VP position. Max didn't understand. The board didn't understand. Even Kingsley's representative assumed it was a mistake. But Silas offered no long explanations. "I've had a full life," was all he said. "Now, I want to live one that's honest." And with that, he walked away from the 46th floor on a Friday afternoon, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag, a few of Ella's drawings, and the first note Lucille had ever written him. "Thank you for showing up at the right time." That evening, he returned to apartment 14. No need to knock. Ella was already waiting. She ran into his arms, hugging him tightly before rising on tiptoes to whisper, "Mom said you're not leaving anymore. Is that true?" Silas bent down, pressing his forehead gently to hers, a quiet vow. "No, I'm staying. For a long, long time." Lucille stood in the doorway, one hand over her heart, her eyes shining with quiet tears. She didn't say anything. She simply stepped forward and laid a hand gently on his shoulder. For the first time, The three of them stood together like a family that didn't need a name. Silas knew he had walked away from an entire world too. Choose a tiny apartment. But in return, he had something he'd never truly had before: love and peace. In the early morning light of the small town where they had chosen to start over, sunlight filtered through the wooden window frames, bathing the new cafe in gold. A simple wooden sign hung by the door, carved with three understated yet meaningful words: Us. It wasn't a name, not a brand. Just a quiet declaration. This was a place for two souls who had once been lost, now finally found. Lena wiped down the counter, her hair tied up to reveal a clear forehead and eyes more radiant than ever. She wore a beige apron embroidered with a lavender flower Theo's handmade gift. The cafe had only recently opened, and business was still slow, but every step inside was met with warmth and genuine smiles. Curious townsfolk dropped by and soon came to love the couple behind the counter. Simple, welcoming, and quietly joyful. In the kitchen, Theo was trying to perfect the plum cake Lena had once said she loved. No more designer suits or high stakes negotiations. These days, his world revolved around flour, ovens, and the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. But far from feeling small, he felt right. As if all those years, he'd simply been lost. When the little bell above the door chimed, Lena looked up and smiled at an elderly couple who had become regulars. They ordered milk, coffee, and honey toast, then took their usual seat by the window. The woman chuckled. "You two made this place feel so cozy. We might just celebrate our 50th wedding anniversary here." Lena blushed. "Oh, it's just a small cafe. Big or small, doesn't matter," the old man said, squeezing his wife's hand, his eyes gleaming. "As long as it's sincere." Lena returned to the kitchen, heart still fluttering from that simple truth. There, she found Theo carefully plating the cake, clumsy but attentive, as if each slice carried real meaning. "Don't look at me like that," Theo muttered with a half-smile, catching her leaning against the doorway, eyes filled with quiet laughter. "You know I'm no expert baker. You're the first to ever bake, just because I like it." Her words made Theo pause. He looked up at her, gaze steady. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to have everything: money, power, a future carved in stone. But I felt empty. And now waking up next to you, hearing you hum in the kitchen, that's everything too." "Me." Lena didn't reply. She stepped forward, gently wiped a smear of flour from his cheek. Their breath mingled close enough for both their hearts to skip. "I used to think I'd live alone forever," she said softly. "I didn't believe anyone could truly understand the kind of loneliness I carried. But then you came quiet, unhurried, and I stopped being afraid." A tender silence wrapped around them. Outside, sparrows chirped. Inside, the scent of fresh-baked pastries and coffee filled the air like a wordless song. Lena looked up at him, her eyes no longer hesitant. "Do you see?" she whispered. "Love doesn't need grand promises. Sometimes it's just you pouring my tea just the way I like it. Me saving the best bite of cake for you. It's us choosing each other every day." Theo didn't answer with words. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle, steady. Not a kiss of fleeting passion, but of quiet certainty. The kind of kiss that says, "I've found what truly matters." That afternoon, they sat together on the steps outside the cafe. The customers had all gone. The sun was setting behind the distant hills, painting the sky a deep orange. Lena leaned her head on Theo's shoulder, and he held her hand. Their fingers interlaced. "I think us is the perfect name," she said softly. "Yeah," Theo replied, "'cause we're no longer two separate people. We're one Usin. This life." And just like that, without lavish ceremonies, without grand contracts, there was a little cafe, a slow-paced life, and two hearts brave enough to let everything go to move toward each other. They didn't know what the future would bring, but they knew that in every cup of coffee, every slice of cake, every quiet brush of fingers and meeting of eyes, a love was growing, peaceful, lasting, and true. Asterisk, and that was the end of Silas, Lucille, and Ella's story. But maybe it's also the beginning of a new way to love, a slower way to live, and a deeper way to belong. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand promises. Sometimes it's in the quiet things, a man who shows up every evening without being asked, a woman who dares to trust again, and a little girl who simply believes that staying is the most powerful thing of all. We hope this story made your heart a little softer, a little braver. If it did, let us know in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Snail's story with someone who needs a gentle story tonight. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep believing in slow, true love.